This week we're looking at the great and very important figures of Sergius and Severus in terms of the Monophysite, Miaphysite approach to Chalcedon and the question of the union and distinction in the person of Jesus Christ regarding his unity as well as his human and divine natures. This lecture will focus on Sergius, who really is important in the history of Christology, especially in terms of Miaphysite or Monophysite Christology, because of his exchange with the patriarch or then patriarch of Antioch, Severus. And so, while looking at Sergius, we find a true shift in terms of the discussion from formula or formulae to a drilling down in or a focusing upon coming to grips with certain concepts and thereby arriving at greater conceptual clarity regarding the mia phýsis to theoû lógou sesarkōménē, the one incarnate nature of God the Word. And this lecture will focus on Sergius, his own conception as well as the errors that flow from his own conception. So why do we care about Sergius? In fact, very little is known of him. He was kind of a shadowy figure, but we do know Sergius through his work, especially his correspondence with Severus, in fact, exclusively through his correspondence with Severus of Antioch, the great Miaphysite patriarch and theologian of Miaphysitism, the anti-Chalcedonian conception of Christ. His correspondence comprises 3 letters with replies of Sergius as well as with Severus as well as a final apology. What we do know of Sergius is that he was called the grammarian, or Sergius Scholasticus in Latin, and that he was an amateur theologian trained in philosophy very clearly, and that his correspondence with Severus began sometime before the year 518, that being the year that Severus was removed from his position as Patriarch of Antioch. Severus himself avers that Sergius was an amateur theologian and in fact warned him to leave off speculative theology. And I'll just read a quotation from Severus in one of his letters to Sergius. Severus writes, "Avoid writing doctrinal teachings and do not easily approach this, for such things belong, as you know, to those who are much instructed and have meditated diligently on the scriptures inspired by God and have grown rich on the toils of the things of the same Spirit, the tested former teachers of the mysteries in the Holy Church, and not to those recently instructed in the knowledge of divine teaching." So in some sense, Sergius was an academic or a desktop theologian who was, in a sense, a Johnny-come-lately or perhaps an interloper in the realm of theological discourse. Nevertheless, because of his interest in theology as well as his analytical ability to analyze concepts pertaining to nature and essence and their union and some of the results of his own speculations, Severus nevertheless deems it necessary to reply to Sergius in order to, from his own Miaphysite foundation, his own Cyrillian Miaphysite foundation, correct certain tendencies and, in fact, outright errors in Sergius's thought that would run contrary not just to Chalcedon. Both Severus and Sergius would be perfectly happy with that, but also to what Severus understood as the correct or orthodox teaching regarding the one incarnate Christ as articulated and taught and formulated by Cyril of Alexandria himself. Sergius's main concerns, along with Cyril and the rest of the Alexandrians, were to emphasize and seek to protect the unity of Jesus Christ as manifested in the biblical and partial conciliar tradition. So what Sergius is trying to put forward is the same picture with development and greater clarity that is put forth in the Gospels themselves and as articulated in the writings of Cyril of Alexandria, as well as the conciliar tradition inclusive of Nicaea, Constantinople I, and Ephesus. Sergius's particular ability lay in noting ambiguity and in terms of terminology, as well as in terms of conceptual usage and clarity through those terms in the existing Miaphysite formulation and reception of Cyril's own teachings. Clearly, Sergius is an analytical thinker who desires to come to a further resolution to lingering difficulties and ambiguities in expressing the positive content of faith, what the faith actually teaches, while at the same time, along with the rest of the Severian or extreme Cyrillian Alexandrian Christological school, to block Nestorian duality, as well as the crypto or perhaps creeping Nestorianism of Leo through his tome, as well as the Council of Chalcedon. So in this sense, Sergius and Severus are of one mind and one goal or intention in terms of avoiding any form of duality in Christ. For the Cyrillian school, the unity of Christ is the fundamental conceptual basis, and thereby the controlling, or what becomes the controlling framework of any further articulation of the doctrine or the Christian revelation or dogma of the Incarnation. The terms and concepts which, or about which, Sergius sought greater clarity and consistency were the same terms and concepts that had been at issue in both the Miaphysite theological tradition, Christological tradition, as well as in the Chalcedonian Christological tradition and their interaction. These terms are property or quality in the original Syriac, dilit, or in Greek, idioma, essence or ousia in terms of the abstract kind of thing it is, nature as that abstract essence made concrete in terms of a really existing being, the notion of hypostasis as it relates to essence and nature, ousia and phýsis, in terms of the really individual or individuating thing, the ultimate subject of attribution or predication. Also the notion of sign, the manifestation of a given essence or nature in terms of those observing it, the way in which a given being, a given kind of being acts in order to manifest and make clear what that being is and how its agency is indicative of the essence which is acting itself. And then finally, the notion of union. Enosis is the word that Cyril uses and becomes common parlance, but also you'll find then in Sergius, as well as Severus in his criticisms of Sergius, the taking up of the Greek notions of krasis or mixis, which have to do with the notion of mixture or mingling, as well as then what become equivalent in both Sergius, the later Sergius, in his, or at least in his later letters and apology, as well as in Severus, the equating of the notion of synthesis, or in Latin, in a Latin-based language, composition, a placing together of two things with respect to the union. So whereas Cyril thought henosis was a term and a concept sufficient to identify and denote the union in Christ, Sergius forces the issue by entering into or introducing this notion of mixture, which is then further clarified with and through conversation with Severus in terms of synthesis. So we find then in Sergius henosis, because henosis is not sufficient to explain the unity with respect to the difference of divinity and humanity in the one Christ. He enters into the conversation new concepts of mixture, which then becomes synthesis through his interaction with Severus. And it should be mentioned right now that Severus himself, as we will see in the next lecture, employs this notion of synthesis to further explain what he understands Cyril to be communicating with his more basic notion and perhaps broader notion of henosis or union. So here in Sergius, we find that all of the basic terms at work throughout the entire orbit of Christological discussion, both Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian, are brought to bear in his own discussion of Christ and his own contribution, whether to the good or to the bad, to these questions, or to the question of the unity and distinction in Christ. All the major terms are at play and receive further discussion, and in certain ways clarification, but also through the very act of clarification, further exposure of erroneous tendencies in fundamental principles and approaches to these questions on the part of the Miaphysites that then the Chalcedonian theologians just a few decades later will take up and further clarify, and which will reach a certain high point of clarity in the 7th century in the councils of, well, the Lateran Synod of 649, as well as Constantinople III, 680. And especially through the great theological figures of Sophronius of Jerusalem and Maximus the Confessor, you will see the notion of nature, essence, hypostasis, and then a further term of energy come to the fore in explaining the consistent and coherent orthodox understanding of the diophysite position flowing out of Chalcedon, a position which is already hinted at, and the groundwork is laid by Pope Leo himself, as well as the Council, in terms of their assertion that the one Christ operates in and through the divine and human natures, according, respectively, to the forms or the forma of those natures, such that each nature becomes a principle of its own intrinsic operation, even if the operation is ultimately attributable to the one subject or hypostasis of the person of the Word, as well as even if the person of the Word as hypostasis is what ultimately grounds and explains the unity and existence of both natures as such in their distinction and in their distinct operation, distinct yet inseparable operations. So for the first element of Sergius's Christological speculation, we can say that his point of emphasis and his point of departure and the leading concern of his entire exposition is to preserve the unity of Christ as he understands it coming down from and through St. Cyril of Alexandria, and which, according to his understanding and reception of Cyril, is contrary to both Nestorianism and also to the formula of Chalcedon. Commenting a bit further on this, we will discover with Sergius, or in Sergius, as also with Severus in the next lecture, that he was strongly rooted in Cyril and the mia phýsis formula, the one incarnate nature of God the Word. Regarding this formula, Sergius glosses it by saying, we do not speak of two natures or properties. And this is an important distinction, nature and property. And he adds the term property, or property rather, becomes a special concern for Sergius in terms of his own articulation of the one Christ, or what he will begin to call the mia ousia of Christ, later on in his discussion in terms of his explanation of the union. So Sergius again says, we do not speak of two natures or properties after the inexpressible union. Going on, he says that we admit only one property of God incarnate out of two. So Sergius is zeroing in on already what he's going to articulate further and argue for further in terms of there being only one property with respect to the one incarnate God. So what he's saying then is the final outcome or result of the incarnation as a mixing, or as he will come to say, as a synthesis out of the two natures, is a unique and emergent reality that is both abstractly distinct as an essence from either the incarnate, from either the divinity as such or human nature as such, but rather is a new thing, a new species that arises or emerges out of the synthesis, which is for him the kenosis or union of the one incarnate nature of God the Logos. What we see right off the bat then is that Sergius is understanding that there should be an equal sign between the notion of property or idioma and nature. Thus, for Sergius, two properties entail two natures, and thus their separation, according to his interpretation of both Nestorius and Leo and the Chalcedonians. So for Sergius, if you admit two properties in the one Christ, then there must be two natures, and if there are two natures, they must be separate, and they must be distinct hypostases. Thus, you have two Christs, not one Christ. Cyril, on the other hand, held that kenosis was sufficient to block separation, and he avoided the notion of mixture, either as the notion of juxtaposition, or a pure mixture as such, or in terms of a kind of mingling. Cyril just simply avoided the language and thought that the language of union, the assertion of union, the decree of union, was sufficient to block any separation, and thus any question of two Christs or two hypostases, the divine and the human. On this point, Cyril says that kenosis implies no confusion and no mixing of the natures, that namely the divine and human, with one another. Going on, he said, yes, there is a distinction, but not separation. Severus, on the other hand, following Cyril, wanted to avoid both extremes of separation and of mixing. In this sense, Severus understood mixing differently than Sergius, and thought that mixing, if allowed to stand in terms of either krasis or mixis, which we'll define a little bit later, he thought that this would entail a true kind of falling into the error of Eutyches, and thus a kind of, or Apollinarius, and thus entail a genuine monophysitism, which would be the synthesis or combination, thus producing a new kind of being that is divine human rather than divine and human. On the contrary, for Sergius, the notion of mixing was the only way to preserve the union as a singular nature and property. The only way for Sergius's understanding to preserve the singularity of Christ in its historical and biblical manifestation and representation was to admit that there was a mixing of the human and divine in some manner that preserved their integrity, yet allowed for the true assertion and, as we will see, signification of a singular Christ incarnate. The one nature or one incarnate nature of God the Word. But before going on, we need to understand how and what these mixing terms mean and how they are used. And Sergius, as we will see, applies only the last two terms of mixing to Jesus Christ, and he uses these terms interchangeably. In the first place, mixing can simply be a kind of confusion from the Greek word synkusis, and this is something that Sergius, in common with the entirety of the Alexandrian tradition, inclusive of Cyril, Timothy, Aelurus, and Severus himself, will deny. However, he does say that krasis and mixis, roughly translated as mixture or mixture qua mingling or to mingle, are appropriate and need to be ascribed to the one phýsis of God the Word incarnate in order to preserve the union. On this point, Sergius writes, I acknowledge that once the divine union is mentioned, confusion is set aside. But here the union is not thought of in a faulty way when the natures are unmixed in a divine and inexpressible mingling, mixis, and in a hypostasis. So the question then turns to, well, what does and what can mixing mean? And here you have competing accounts that ultimately end up in a certain synthetic reception on the part of Sergius between Stoic and Aristotelian mixing. And we'll get to this notion of mixing just a little bit later. But to begin, though, for Sergius, it is essential for him and his account of the union of Christ to assert that there was a mixing or a mingling of the divine and human in the one Christ, and thus the one Christ figure, the incarnate logos, phýsis, is actually a new species within the reality and organization, say, of Porphyry and his tree, as well as a new species or ousia that can be then included or understood in terms of the Aristotelian category of substance. However, Sergius does not want to admit that somehow the divine qua divine and the human qua human mix together and become some new divine human thing. And this is where a great incoherency of his thought becomes very apparent early on, is maintaining the consistency of the language of mixture while denying there's any kind of confusion on the one hand, while on the other hand asserting that the one phýsis, the one incarnate phýsis of God the Word, is in itself a new essence or ousia, and thus a new property that exists in a unity wherein the divine and human aspects of Christ's actions are indistinguishable. Sergius himself recognizes that up to this point, his account is incomplete with respect to union, and he's hesitant in terms of clarifying absolutely and once and for all what he means by the concept of union in and through the notion of mixing. We might say then that the notion of mia phýsis itself, when predicated of Jesus Christ, is in itself underdetermined, and it doesn't yet capture the reality that's signified and thus underpinning the historical and biblical presentation of Jesus Christ in his concrete individuality, in his concrete history. And he goes on to say that the mere addition of the concept of incarnation in reference to another nature, namely the human nature, could lead towards a recognition of two separate natures, and thus end up in terms of a denial of the hypostatic union itself. So what he's afraid of is that mia phýsis doesn't really explain enough, and if you say incarnate, one incarnate nature, one incarnate mia phýsis, then it seems to open the door back towards a recognition of two separate natures and thus two separate hypostases, and end up heading back down the road of Nestorianism and the creeping Nestorianism, according to Sergius and also Severus of Chalcedon itself. In defense of Sergius, it should be noted right away, however, that his application of mixing or mingling was in terms of a growing together, what in Greek could be called a symphonia. This was what he thought to be a via media between a Nestorian extrinsic juxtaposition, a parathesis, or a synkusis, and a true confusion. So with this symphonia, which he bases himself on a text from Gregory Nazianzus, he wants to formulate a new singular or monadic image and hypostasis of the one incarnate logos with a singular sign and property, and as we will see, a property that encompasses or experiences the conflation into of the other concepts of nature or phýsis, as well as ousia. Also note that Sergius will abandon the notion of mixing language for the language of synthesis under the guidance of Severus. You can see this in letter 3, as well as in his Apologia, where he uses the terms mixis, crasis, and synthesis in a roughly synonymous manner. So if Sergius is seeing the problem of the underdetermination of the notion of one nature, or mia phýsis, as well as the ambiguity and perhaps latent Nestorian and Chalcedonian tendencies of adding the notion or concept of incarnation with respect to the humanity, he says we need to set out on a new direction. And pardon the pun, this new direction brings with it mixed results. Sergius writes, quote, I learned that the combination of two or more simple things into one thing belongs to the principle of composition, in which what is complete is also a part, and afterwards the parts are not from then on adjudged according to the principle of duality, since once and for all one ousia and one quality or property has come into being. And here you can see then he's employing an analogy of union according to the notion of composition, which is basically Aristotelian, and which gives us a way to analyze and speak of simple perfections, in the words of Duns Scotus, that are in themselves made up of constituent parts, but which are in themselves unitary realities or substances. For example, the essence of a man is a composite or composition of body and soul, in which both are partial substances which come together and are mutually informing and reciprocative in an ordered manner, body to soul, of the one whole man, the one whole essence, the one whole species or perfection or simple perfection of mankind itself. And you can see these in other composite entities such as dogs, animals, or trees, plants, in which in the coming together of an animal composite substance, there's nevertheless are two principles at the very least of matter and form. In the case of a dog, matter and the form dogness come together to form the one simple perfection of being a dog. And with a plant or a tree, the material component comes together and is informed by, yet individuates, the form of treeness. And so in this sense, the duality comes together into one simple entity that doesn't deny or preclude further analysis, but nevertheless, when that one simple whole is further analyzed, you're dealing more in the realm of abstractions rather than concrete realities on the one hand, and on the other hand, notwithstanding the dual or the duality of principles in any one of these compositions, the reality as such, in terms of, with, for example, human nature, the actions or manifestations of that nature are attributed to the whole, not in the first sense and not properly to a part. So once the two parts come together in this organic and real composition, the parts are not then adjudged according to the principle of duality, because they are in reality one essence or ousia and one quality or property that manifests the essence or ousia in and through the real nature operating. And so with this Aristotelian part-whole composition of simples analysis, he's able to apply this to the incarnation via the form-matter distinction applied to the body-soul analogy. And this will create certain problems when the analogy is no longer understood as analogy, but rather is understood as, or understood in univocal terms, as applying in the same sense and under the same exact conditions to the humanity logos composition, in terms of Sergius's articulation of the union or synthesis of the divine and human in the one Christ. A second key event that flows from his desire to preserve the absolute unity of Christ is his articulation and account of the event or act of the incarnation. If he's understanding that the unity of Christ it remains opaque in terms of the conceptual articulation of the mystery of the dogma, he says, well, we need to actually look at the event of the incarnation in order to understand how the divine and human in the one Christ actually are unified. And this is where he will employ his concepts of mixing and or synthesis, according to his understanding of Cyril. Sergius himself says that he, or believes that he gets this notion of the propriety of mixing as applied and as explanatory of the union, kenosis, of the one incarnate nature of God, the word from Cyril himself. He writes, namely Sergius writes, "Wise Cyril urges on my thoughts. I read the law of Cyril to you, Severus, as well." Quote, and here he's quoting Cyril, "He is composed, Jesus is, so as to become one in the middle of human properties, and those which are above man. The Father seems to say, here Cyril, that the incarnate Word was one in every respect. I mean both nature and property, when he," and here it is, "mingled the natures with the properties." But again, how are we to understand this mingling? Torrance has a great and very helpful section on the various notions of mingling, articulated according to both, or understood according historically, both according in terms of Aristotle as well as Stoic philosophy. And his explanation is helpful, and I will simply refer you to that explanation found on pages 62 and following to see exactly how Sergius is both similar and different from the various conceptions of and the differing conceptions of Aristotelian and Stoic notions of middle. Here we'll just look at the theological solution, the philosophical theological solution of Sergius, and also note that Sergius is essentially following certain aspects of both Aristotelian and Stoic philosophy insofar as they both recognize, in terms of the manner in which Sergius uses the notion of mingling or synthesis, three basic factors or characteristics of this union or synthesis or mixing with respect to the one incarnate nature of God the Word. So Sergius holds that in this synthesis or mixture, there's a movement or a coming to a middle point. And so in this sense, we can see that in the reality of the union itself, both the divine and human, in a certain way, come to a certain kind of equilibrium or middle point between themselves. So there's a certain balance in the mingling without a complete loss of or without any loss, according to Sergius's own assertion, of the divinity and humanity considered abstractly. However, in this coming to a middle, there is truly a new ousia, or essence, or species that emerges, namely the one nature or one property of the incarnate logos. Now, this raises certain problems because every theologian involved in this discussion admits that there cannot be a movement of humanity to divinity in terms of nature, nor can there be a changing of divinity into something less than divinity in terms of nature. So if you're going to say that this synthesis affects a kind of coming to the middle, a kind of realizing in the union or synthesis itself some new state that's attributable, or mode of being that's attributable to both the humanity and the divinity in terms of a new unity. And also, there is an emergence of a new essence or property. Then the question then arises, do the constituent parts, namely the humanity and the divinity, remain inact? Namely, are they fully real, or are they now only potentially real? And rather, the reality is now predicated to the new property or ousia that results from the synthesis. So, do the divinity and humanity in the one nature of the one incarnate nature of God the Word, do the humanity and divinity fall into a kind of only latent potency, or are they still actual? How are we to understand the components in their own reality with respect to the new reality of the one incarnate nature? Aristotle would assert that in such a mingling or synthesis, the constituent parts would only be potentially real in terms of or in relation to their prior, meaning prior to the union, reality as constituent parts. So Aristotle would say that if you have two parts that are really constitutive of a new third thing, well, in the event that there's a genuine synthesis, they're no longer real as distinct parts. They're only potentially real in the event that the unity itself is broken or dissolved. So, for example, you might say then that although partial substances and maintaining their own form of activity in the singularity of a really existing human being, the body and soul in that one human being come together to form one reality, and thus separate existence and separate operation as body and or soul would only be potential with respect to the dissolution of the whole composite of the individual man as such. Sergius doesn't really answer this question, but rather falls back into a kind of juxtaposition that seems to violate both the first and second characteristics of the union itself, namely the coming to a middle and the new ousia, because Sergius does want to affirm that in the incarnation, divinity and humanity are truly and integrally whole, and they remain such. But how do you explain this on any philosophical account of mixing? That remains the question. Sergius, however, does provide an interesting analogy of the union in terms of his notion of synthesis or mixing, by explaining that in the union or synthesis that effects or results in the one incarnate nature of God the Word, the divinity is to the humanity as the sun is to a cloud being penetrated by the light of the sun or by the rays of the sun. Thus you can say that the rays of the sun don't alter the essential nature of the cloud, but nevertheless they mingle with the characteristics of the cloud, such that the cloud itself takes on new lightsome characteristics and thus produce arguably a single quality or effect in terms of the illuminated cloud itself. Interesting analogy that helps us better understand what Sergius was going for. The divinity mingles with the humanity such that the divinity and humanity remain distinct, but nevertheless do, in a kind of synthesis, result in a new ousia with a new property, a new mode of manifestation, or rather the manifestation of the single historical Christ indicates that there must be only a singular ousia and property of the one incarnate nature of God the Word. At this point, one might ask, and one should ask, how do we understand the notion of phýsis, which speaks to a concrete nature as an operational principle that terminates or is inclusive of the notion of hypostasis and thus existence, meaning phýsis has to do with concrete realities. How do we understand Sergius's shift in discussion from this notion of the concrete phýsis of the incarnate God the Word to his attribution of a new ousia and also property to this same one incarnate nature of God the Word? We might say then that Sergius is moving from the concrete historical declaratives or declarations of Cyril with respect to the factual unity of Christ in the phýsis of the logos to a discussion of abstract schema that seek to better articulate and define just what that unity is and how that unity is possible beyond just the assertive or assertative formula. Because we will see that even though he makes this shift from a discussion of the concrete phýsis, the one nature or phýsis of the one incarnate nature or phýsis of God the Word, to an assertion of an abstract ousia of the one Jesus Christ, as well as a singular property that manifests itself through signs deriving from and emanating from that singular property. He, on the other hand, will come to equate ousia with phýsis and property. So at the outset of his explanation, he moves from phýsis, concrete, to ousia, abstract, while through his analysis and by the end of his analysis and articulation, he will render equivalent phýsis, ousia, and nature. So following this Cyrillian line, and also to a great extent what Severus, his interlocutor, will want to defend, phýsis remains in the realm of the concrete. It remains in the realm of the historical reality of Jesus Christ, and the formula from two natures through the incarnation, one, phýsis, was meant to serve this perspective. However, the content of the expression could still be disputed and misunderstood, as I mentioned above. You have mia phýsis, as well as the assertion of incarnation. And so we're not quite sure, according to Sergius, what mia phýsis really means and what it entails and encompasses on the one hand, as well as when we predicate incarnate of that mia phýsis, the question can then arise again, which Sergius wants to block as a good Miaphysite, of distinct and thereby, by definition, distinct ipso facto, separate and independent natures, and thus hypostases, with independent existences in the one Christ, and thus the dividing of the one Christ. So on the one hand, then, the content of the expression could still be disputed and misunderstood, and on the other hand, the formula itself didn't yet stake a clear and explicit claim in any philosophical idiom, especially with respect to Aristotle's categories. We will see, though, that when Sergius defines his understanding or articulates his understanding in terms of a new ousia, a new singular ousia that is a composite of divinity and humanity, he's attributing this new ousia of Christ to Aristotle's first category of substance, that which exists in and for its own sake. And thus, it will affect and entail an explicit union of natures according to nature of the divinity and humanity in Christ in terms of the categories, rather than in the Chalcedonian tradition, the unity of natures according to hypostasis, according to person, and thus avoiding the collapsing of the union into the category of substance, and thereby the emergence of a new species. Sergius then shifted henosis to the realm of ousia essence as abstract, and thereby asserted a new thing, the Jesus Christ essence and property, the historical Jesus Christ essence and property, which is singular and manifests both divinity and humanity in an undifferentiated way, rather than in terms of the one Jesus Christ as a divine person, with divine and human energies that operate and manifest according to nature, according to the manifestation of nature. The energies manifest the nature or essence. Rather, now, the one Jesus Christ essence, the composite essence and property of the singular incarnate nature manifests singularly both divinity and humanity with a certain kind of distinction according to reason, but not in according to reality, because any kind of real distinction here would entail for Sergius and the Miaphysites a separation and an independence of the two natures, and thus a falling back into an assertion of two Christs and the error of Nestorius and his followers. So the upshot then of Sergius's shifting of henosis to the realm of ousia, essence as abstract, is that on the one hand it further clarifies within the Miaphysite system or systematics, its theoretical articulation of the incarnation, as well as its philosophical and theological categories and concepts. Sergius's shift produces a certain greater clarity, but in the production and realization of the greater clarity, a deeper problem to the entire system, and the ambiguity in the original Cyrillian formula of the one incarnate nature of God the Word comes more to the fore. Because through this mixing, there is a new kind of thing abstractly, in terms of essence, or second intention, an essence that is the Jesus Christ essence, divine human essence, in second intention, as well as in reality the one property of the incarnation itself, the one property being the singular unique quality of God-manness in Christ, in the one incarnate Christ. So instead of opening up a greater clarity and understanding of the articulation, what Sergius is in effect doing is creating a fundamental ambiguity through a mixing, an inextricable mixing of divinity and humanity to produce a new kind of God-manness that is destructive of both the divinity and humanity, and in fact unintelligible in terms of the categories, as well as in terms of any kind of preservation of the transcendence of God himself, God in his essence, on the one hand, as well as the real activity, the reality of the humanity of Christ in his truly, at least apparently, human activities and operations. In order to address this difficulty, Sergius makes use and makes appeal to a standard kind of Alexandrian analogy for explaining the union in terms of the body-soul as a species of, or an instance of, the form-matter relationship of composite beings as they pertain to the humanity and divinity as both constituent parts of a new whole. So the body and the soul come together as matter and form in order to produce one simple, composite, and complete, what Scotus will call a perfection, or a simple perfection of human nature as such. There's an intelligibility, there's an essential unity, and thereby a substantial unity of a human being in terms of the composition of body and soul. Both body and soul are constitutive elements of the one simple unity and perfection of a human being. That same analogy then is extended by Sergius following the Alexandrian tradition to a form-matter, or rather parts-whole relationship with respect to a consideration of the one incarnate nature of God the Word. In this event, you have the result, the one incarnate nature of God the whole, and for Sergius, therefore, the one ousia, the one incarnate ousia of God the Word, and thus the one property of God the Word qua incarnate, in terms of understanding that in this new property, the resulting property is composed of, according to the body-soul analogy, the form-matter analogy, is composed of parts. Parts that Sergius will assert are total and complete in themselves, but nevertheless function as partial forms to a new synthesis or new composite being, namely Jesus Christ in his concrete historical reality. So what you have then is a direct application, even a univocal application, a collapsing of analogy here of the body and soul as constituent parts of one whole, namely the human being, applied to the one ousia or property of Jesus Christ, in which humanity and divinity come together as parts with respect to the synthetic production or result of Jesus himself as he concretely existed and continues to exist. As I've stated earlier, this analogy is commonplace among the Alexandrians. And as Sergius reads it, as body and soul form one new composite simple man, so man and logos form one new composite synthesis, namely Jesus Christ. Here we see that an analogy of simple beings, what we've already discussed, namely dogs, trees, human beings, function as paradigms. Simple beings that are nevertheless composed function as paradigms of, or the paradigm of unity. And Sergius, using this analogy, will simply assert, because he recognizes that composition without confusion can result in a more perfectly unified ousia, namely man as rational animal. That's an example. Clearly, the soul doesn't become the body, and the body doesn't become the soul, so there's no confusion there. Nevertheless, in that composition, one higher reality, more perfectly unified, ousia, results. Going on, then the new ousia, with property and nature, actually explains how Jesus Christ fills the role as the middle being that Cyril speaks of. So with this new ousia, the natures of divinity and humanity come together, and in this very union of natures, according to nature, we find a truly middle being, not necessarily a middle person, assuming, in the words of St. Bonaventure, the middle being, namely humanity, who in himself, in his nature, combines spiritual with material, and thus unifies the order of pure spirits and the order of purely material beings into one composite being of both matter and spirit, ordered, the matter that or the body that is being ordered to and for the sake of spirit. Rather, Sergius thinks of this middle being, according to nature, as producing this new ousia of the God-manness of Jesus Christ as really truly fulfilling the role of a middle being, a perfect middle being that Cyril speaks of, as we mentioned earlier. Moreover, the notion of ousia, in terms of Aristotle, qua substance, that the first category of substance, the other nine, first of 10, the other nine being the accidents. Ousia qua substance fits into Aristotle's first category and adds to Porphyry's tree as a new species with a sui generis ousia. In this sense, as an essence or species, Christ's God-manness exhausts the species, and thus the singularity of Jesus Christ in his divine humanness coextends the species, and the species itself is sui generis. There is no species other than Jesus Christ himself that is a composite of rationality, animality, and divinity. And so with Sergius, we discover that with this new ousia, abstractly considered, we find that it fits within the category of substance, and also we've discovered a new branch on Porphyry's tree of a species as rational animal divinity. And at this point then, Sergius is happy to make an equivalence of physis and ousia to serve the reality that he's trying to concretely articulate and understand of the historical Jesus Christ. He's happy to make a full equivalence of physis and ousia, and thus bite the bullet and say that this ousia is also a phýsis, as it practically worked out in time. And I'll just read where Sergius, from his, let's see here, his third letter, Sergius reaches the point of making an equivalence between physis and ousia that then, in my opinion, indicates that in terms of ontology and as well as metaphysics, Sergius is a consistent monophysite, even though he wants to step back away from the monophysitism of Eutyches or Apollinarius in terms of a lack of integrity and totality with respect or in the divine and human natures themselves. Nevertheless, in the new ousia, or this synthetic ousia, this union of divinity and humanity according to nature, results in truly a new nature that is neither divine nor human, and a new essence that is neither divine nor human, but rather a synthesis of both, which thus in turn expresses itself and operates and manifests itself through a singular divine human energy, a theandric energy, in the words of a contemporary of his, the Pseudo-Dionysius, as well as a singular property. And of course, this not only cuts against and contradicts the implications of Chalcedon, but it will also come into explicit contradiction to the later Diophysite dual energy or dienergetic articulation of Lateran 649 as well as Constantinople 680. And so we see then through Sergius's Miaphysite / Monophysite ontology and metaphysics of the incarnation, he ends up implicitly violating the dithyllite Orthodox doctrine of Christ as presented in Lateran 649 and Constantinople 680. Now to that quote from Sergius. We read, "The words physis and ousia mean the same thing as far as we are concerned, the one being derived from pephukenai and the other from enai." Going on. "Therefore, if we teach from two natures, physis, one nature, physis, of the Word incarnate, how do we sin against the mystery if, by means of the words with the same meaning, we fulfill the same doctrine in saying that from two ousiae there is one ousia of the Word incarnate?" Going on, in support of his point, he appeals to the philosophers, and he says, writing to Sergius in the same letter, "I urge you, O Father, to endure for a little my presumption with regard to the precision of the philosophers. Even if they are outside our fold, we shall greatly clarify the explanation. Among the philosophers, Aristotle said these words, quote, 'But ousia is, if one will speak with an example, such as man or horse.' But this is not the case that he does not acknowledge the composition of the living creatures because of this. For everything which is simple remember that notion of simple perfections, is understood, rather than falling under the senses. So here he's saying that this is an abstract concept, a second intention concept. Nevertheless, it is a concept of something real, a horse or a man, and in the case of Christ, the one composite Christ. Going on with Sergius, therefore, how do I defraud the truth when I call the incarnate word ousia, and understand this ousia to be incarnate? So much for Sergius on the question of the identity or the equivalence of the body-soul analogy and the synthetic union of the divinity and humanity, the divinity and the logos and the humanity in the one Christ. It's interesting to note at this point that where Sergius began, or rather perhaps where Cyril began with the Apollinarian formula of the one incarnate nature of God the Word, Sergius, because of already the underdetermination of the mia phýsis coupled with the augmentation or modification of the word incarnate, that could, according to Sergius, lend itself to either a Nestorian or Chalcedonian approach to Christology. Sergius simply modifies and abridges the formula to simply the mia ousia Christ, the one essence or nature Christ. And there are a few steps that he states in order to arrive at this simplified definition. In the first instance, with Cyril and with Severus and with the tradition, he admits that there's one pre-existent phýsis or phýsis, and that equals the logos. The phýsis of the logos, the phýsis possessed or terminating in the person of the Word. However, in and or post-incarnation, one ousia equal, namely phýsis, as we've already read, comes into being. And this encompasses the logos and humanity. And thus for Sergius, the result of this composition is a new simple in terms of category of substance and in terms of species. What we have is a new ousia, a new kind of substance, and a new notion of a kind of being in terms of species. Thus, because of this unity, there's a twofold mode of manifestation as well as principle of manifestation. So we find then that because of the composite ousia, there also is a composite mode of signification post-incarnation. And this mode of signification of the God-manness of the divine human, one Christ, one ousia of Christ, one substance Christ, there's a combined unitary property. And this unitary property is simply the reality of the one Christ, for example. And here Sergius uses, as you know through your readings, uses examples from the history of salvation in the life of Christ. So there are new properties that only Christ, the one Christ, qua divine human, can manifest. Thus there's only one singular property, that, or quality, the divine human Christ possesses, because he possesses only one ousia and one nature. Thus, and let me step back a bit. Therefore, because of this one property, on the one hand, as source and principle, as well as the reality of the singular unitary signification of this one property through events and realities possible only in terms of the incarnation of the one substance Christ. Therefore, we have a new kind of reality and a new mode of manifestation. So on the one hand, you have miracles being accomplished by Christ through the one property. You don't say the miracles belong to the divinity or the humanity in terms of separation or even real distinction. Rather, the one Christ is the subject of miracles on the one hand. He is the subject of the virgin birth. Now, this is neither possible to a human alone, for example, the virgin birth. This is something impossible to humanity as such, as well as to divinity. It's only in the incarnation that you find the reality and miracle of the virgin birth. So Sergius is arguing then that there must be a singular property because only the one ousia, the mia ousia of Christ, or who is Christ, manifests and experiences. I'll read from Sergius on this point. Likewise, and this is from his third letter, likewise I acknowledge on the one hand that the ensouled flesh, which is united to the Word, and here we hear him moving away from the notion of mixture, chrosis or mixis, going on with Sergius. For I fear to say mixed is human and of our nature, but on the other hand, insofar as it is composed to be one with God, it exists with those special properties in comparison to our flesh, namely the working of miracles, the virgin birth, etc. Going on with Sergius, for it did not accept sin as a result of transgression. It was not obliged to hunger and thirst and sleep, but to be occupied with the word to which it was united, which willed to suffer those things for the sake of the confirmation of the inhomination. And basically the point is, here he's identifying events in salvation history unique to the person of Christ, that thereby, according to his mind, indicates the singularity and unicity of property or quality, and thereby ousia and nature. And this singularity, this new ousia, is precisely through the composition of humanity and divinity, according to the body-soul analogy in the one Christ. So for a summation of Sergius's understanding of the incarnation in the realm of metaphysics or ontology, in the realm of being, we find three main aspects that can be considered. The first is the union of essences themselves, or ousiai, the event or act of bringing those ousiai together into a new ousia, as well as the result of the bringing together or synthesis of the ousiai. And there are some positive and negative aspects. In terms of the positive aspects, I'll put plus signs, and the negative aspects, I'll put minus signs in front of. And you can see that, in my opinion, there are more negatives than positives in terms of both Sergius's insights and methodology, as well as, and more importantly, his theological and quasi-dogmatic conclusions with respect to the reality and mode and possibility of the incarnation. So with respect to the union of the ousiai, there are two positive aspects which are common to everyone in this discussion. The first positive is that the two ousiai that are brought together in synthesis are true God and true man, and both of these ousiai are each total and complete. They're not partial in themselves, even if they function as partial causes in the synthesis of the new ousia, the mia ousia of Christ, or who is Christ. The negatives with respect to the union of essences is that, I just mentioned it, each ousia functions as partial forms with respect to the one composite, singular, and ultimate, and only reality of the one ousia of Christ. So, even if Sergius perhaps inconsistently asserts that both the divinity and the logos are complete essences in themselves, nevertheless they function as partial essences or causes or forms with respect to the new overarching and over-encompassing new ousia that is Jesus Christ as one ousia. Another negative aspect is because of the emphasis on the logos and the emphasis on the assuming, along with the body-soul analogy, there tends to be a diminution of any real activity of the human soul. Thus, for Sergius, even though he will assert that there's true and integral and complete humanity in Christ, nevertheless, functionally, his Christology is a lot closer to Apollinarius, even though Apollinarius said Christ didn't have a human soul, and the logos supplied for the human soul in a composite that is more pernicious and further away from the truth than what Sergius taught. Nevertheless, functionally, Sergius is unable to ascribe any positive activity to the human soul. That's simply because the principle of activity is the logos qua singular, new, one, unitary ousia of Christ. Another element is that's important to note here with respect to the union of essences is Sergius, along with Severus, will make use of the Dionysian distinction between ousia and hyperousia, and this is simply a recognition that God in himself is beyond essence. Nevertheless, it's difficult to see how he consistently uses the term ousia with respect to the union itself, meaning with respect to the divinity or divine nature with reference to the unity in Christ. If, on the other hand, he's asserting that the ousia is hyperousia, it seems difficult to see how there could be a new ousia when ousia and hyperousia are not understood in a univocal sense, and perhaps if hyperousia implies a kind of agnosticism and unattainability on the part of a finite essence or nature, it seems difficult to see how he's using that. So while it works to preserve distinction and perhaps is helpful in that sense, it doesn't actually serve to explain his or illumine his account of the union of the essences or ousiai as such. With respect then to moving on to the event or act of the synthesis slash henosis, the analogy of body and soul here leads to a sense of mutual information in the Aristotelian sense, meaning that there is a certain potency in the divinity that is informed by the humanity, in the coming into being of the one or mia ousia of Christ, or that who is Christ. There seems to be a certain information of the divinity with respect to the humanity, and vice versa, such that there is truly a mixing and a violation of the transcendence of divinity with respect to creation, which results ipso facto if there is information, and thus a real kind of identification going on between the divinity of Christ and his humanity in the order of nature, there's a kind of dependence then that arises on the part of the logos on the humanity in forming or becoming the new mia ousios itself. Related to the same question or same problem is that the synthesis is on the level of phýsis ousia for Sergius. This union is of natures according to nature. Thus, it becomes difficult to see how you can effect a union if the natures are to remain distinct, and if they're not distinct, then it seems to violate both the assertion of the totality and integrity and of humanity and divinity respectively, as well as the transcendence of divinity in itself. Another negative aspect of Sergius's account of the union in Christ is that it results in truly a new middle ousia. And, as I've stated earlier, if ousia equals phýsis, a new phýsis, and if phýsis and ousia in property are equivalent, a new divine human property. From this then follows, in terms of the result of the union, a new ousia or essence as a new species, which entails a contradiction because there cannot be a divine human species. That would be a violation of the very doctrine of God, and it would introduce change and dependency and thus deny independence to God in terms of his nature, but more importantly, to God in terms of subsisting in and existing in and terminating in three distinct persons. With respect to this question, God the Word, God the Logos. Out of this contradiction, there flows a diminution of God in himself and in his transcendence, as I've already mentioned, as well as a functional swallowing up, as I've already alluded to, with respect to the human activity, a denial of the human activity of the soul of Christ, which is common to both Sergius and Severus, as we will see. We find a functional swallowing up of humanity, and thus the question is, what does Christ's humanity really have to do with our salvation? And what role does it have beyond being a purely passive and, by implication, irrational agent if all the initiative is on the part of the Logos without any respect to the proper form of the humanity as such, as rational, with its own principle or energy of operation? So for Sergius, we find that Christ is one being who has one property and one nature because there's one ousia, a new ousia. Clearly, he's attempting to bar the doors to both Nestorianism and Chalcedon, but through his synthesis or mixing, he ends up in absurdities that tend to reprise Apollinarius through an application of. And in fact, it should be noted that Apollinarius himself suffered from a mishandling of Aristotelian philosophical concepts projected back into or back upon the person of Christ. Sergius himself falls into structurally parallel errors with respect to his use of Aristotle, insofar as he asserts through the synthesis or union of divinity and humanity a new species or essence or ousia of Christ that is distinct as a nature, as an ousia, from the divinity and humanity. In fact, Sergius doesn't really actually solve the question of union or advance the understanding of union, even from Cyril or in terms of what Severus will do. He introduces all sorts of confusions and absurdities because he doesn't, as St. John of Damascus will warn, he doesn't properly understand and distinguish nature and person. It should be noted at this point, too, that because of Sergius's, or on account of his metaphysical commitments and his understanding of the unity or synthesis of the logos and the humanity in Christ, there are certain negative implications for the sacramentality and semiotic function of creation as well as the sacraments. This is simply because in order, according to Sergius, for God to fully act or to adequately act, there cannot be a cooperation, a synergistic cooperation between a creature and the Holy Spirit. Rather, there must be a kind of melding and a new species of action that, on the one hand, conflates divinity and humanity, while on the other hand, evacuating their reality as such in terms of their own intrinsic forms or energies or principles of operation and manifestation. And thus, creation, it loses its sacramentality because God doesn't adequately, or perhaps cannot adequately, communicate through creation apart from himself becoming creation, not in terms of a union hypostatically or in terms of person, but in terms of nature to nature, or union according to nature. Thus, a created reality itself would no longer be strictly created, but would rather be some new synthetic, divine, created, infinite, finite composition that would be neither here nor there, neither divine nor created. And so there would be a kind of whiting out of the book of creation as such, as well as by a certain kind of parallel analogy, because the sacraments themselves function on the basis of the intelligibility of creation as such. There would be a kind of falsification of the sacraments, because for sacraments to function, there could no longer be a divine human synergism or cooperation, what Scotus will call essentially ordered causes producing a unified effect, but rather the cause itself would be unified and thereby be the principle of a unified effect. So it systematically and by implication rules out synergism across the board in both creation and in terms of the Church's ministry in sacraments, as well as the semiotic or symbolic function and meaning of the scriptural interpretation in terms of the relationship between Old and New Testaments. What this metaphysics does is, in essence, it collapses the distinction between God and creation and creates a new kind of synthetic mode of being that is neither God nor creation. And it tends to a kind of monergism in which divinity swallows up creation and sacraments and church into this new kind of third reality, rather than in terms of a new mode of operation that nevertheless preserves the integrity of the forms or principles, created and uncreated, as distinct, yet nevertheless cooperating to produce a single unified effect. In summing up, we can see that Sergius certainly pushes the Miaphysite position to its logical absurdities, and in so doing raises, perhaps unwittingly or unintentionally, many weaknesses in the conceptual starting points and foundations and principles of the Miaphysite position. And that is truly salutary, because through the consistent articulation of his theology, he was clarifying for the Orthodox position and making more apparent where the problems in their theology lay, and that is good from a perspective of systematic and dogmatic theology, as well as an evaluation of the development of dogma as it occurred in conversation with Miaphysites, and as the Miaphysites themselves presented challenges to the Chalcedonian position, forcing the Chalcedonians to clarify and improve their own articulation of the primordial mystery. On the other hand, in my opinion, Sergius does a good job of drawing out the theological, philosophical, and logical inconsistencies of the Miaphysite position in a kind of reductio ad absurdum manner by demonstrating just how the rigid and univocal adherence to the Cyrillian/Apollinarian formula of one incarnate nature of God the Word, to the exclusion of the Chalcedonian clarification and the clear recognition and articulation that the phýsis in question in Cyril's formula is the phýsis of the logos, and thus implying a reference to the person of the logos as distinct from, in Chalcedonian terms, the nature. Sergius' position ends up as overall a major failure in terms of articulating and developing a consistent and coherent Miaphysite position that measures up to the standards of revelation, reason, the conciliar and patristic traditions, and ultimately, even on the part of Miaphysites, is rightly rejected, even if Sergius shares a great deal of common ground with, say, the great figure of Severus, with whom we will deal in the next lecture.